Teams were hard at work this week, with crews at the launch site performing first-of-its-kind booster catch and landing simulations. Scrapping of the old cryo tank farm continues, a new crane is added to the skyline, and work continues on the new launch tower. Now let's dig into this week's update. This week at Starbase saw workers continue to scrap the old propellant farm tanks, with the LR-11000 disconnecting from the cryoshell's top dome segment for the final stage of the scrapping. While the dome scrapping was underway, test article B14.1 was moved to the orbital launch mount and connected to SpaceX's GMK 7550 to be placed on the OLM. After working past midnight to secure the test article to the crane, B14.1 was lifted onto the orbital launch mount early on Saturday morning for booster catch testing. Scrapping of the tanks continued throughout Saturday. By Sunday morning, the next cryo tank shell was almost fully cut down, with just one barrel segment to go. Within an hour, the last barrel section of the tank was cut and dragged away, and the dome was set down and ready to be cut apart. The cryo shell was fully cut up and demolished by that afternoon, and the load spreader was brought to the last of the cryo shells to remove it for demolition. Using a lift, workers attached the load spreader to the shell. With the LR-11000 holding the weight of the steel, workers with plasma cutters burned through the base of the tank, freeing the shell for removal and scrapping. Preparations for the first concrete pour in the second launch tower were completed by Monday morning, and pump trucks began setting up to fill the hollow steel forms with concrete. A few minutes later, the pump boom was positioned over an opening in the forms and set to work. While the pour was underway, the last of the cryo tank shells was picked up and set down in the scrapping area, and workers were busy cutting out barrel sections from the base. And after 9 hours of concrete pouring, crews finished their work for the day at the second launch tower, leaving the concrete to cure inside the blast walls and columns. The final cut of the last cryo tank shell's barrel was completed after sunset, and the top dome was hoisted up, providing clearance for the excavator to drag away the barrel before the dome was set back down. With the last barrel section cut away now from the last of the tank shells, the 12-meter load spreader will no longer be needed. Promptly following the removal of the last outer shell's top dome, the 9-meter inner tank load spreader was brought over and picked up by the LR-11000, and the 12-meter load spreader was taken away. Working into Tuesday morning, the load spreader was then lifted over the next cryo tank, continuing the process of scrapping the old propellant tanks. With the assembly and reeving process now completed, the boom was slowly raised on the Sarin CC8800 throughout the day. A few hours into the afternoon, the crane's jib was finally lifted, adding a new element to the launch site skyline. After several hours of cutting the heavily reinforced base supports, the next cryo tank was lifted off its base at the propellant farm and set down at the staging area for scrapping. Another round of concrete placement began at the office building site early Wednesday morning as crews continued the groundwork for the new building. Back at the launch site, there was a mishap during the lift of a dome section during cryo tank scrapping. A weld on the upper tank dome was weakened after the barrel was cut, and the weld failed when the dome section failed to separate from the barrel, sending it crashing down onto the barrel below. A little before noon, SpaceX began the first in a series of Chopstick tests, with test article B14.1 simulating a booster catch with the subscale tank. The flexible, fast-moving chopsticks could be heard bouncing off the side of B14.1 as SpaceX engineers worked to verify that Superheavy could withstand the repeated impacts. 6 tests were conducted in all over the next few hours, leaving marks on the side of the tank where the arm's bumpers contacted the test article. Back near the build site, office building concrete placement concluded a few minutes after noon, with trucks and crews packing up for the day. A pair of steel wall sections for the new launch tower were delivered to the launch site. These wall sections will likely form part of the support base for the tower's drawworks hoist and supporting systems. As the sun set over Starbase, the load spreader was lifted over the next of the vertical cryo tanks and attached to it ahead of scrapping. Concrete placement for the new office building resumed on Thursday, with crews still working at the ground level of the building. Back at the launch complex, Chopstick testing continued with a repeat of the fast Chopstick closure test. In a blink and you'll miss it moment, a delivery of booster chine sections passed by our cameras, which quickly panned over to the load as it was brought into Starbase. Another 2 Chopstick actuation tests were performed on B14.1, one following after the other in quick succession, bringing the day's total to 3. Following a comparatively short pour that lasted under 2 hours, office building concrete placement concluded for the day and the pump truck was packed up and headed out. Another Chopstick actuation test was performed on B14.1 before the Chopsticks followed up with a new test, simulating a booster catch attempt by raising the Chopstick arms to the booster pins and loading the landing rails. This landing rail load test was followed up by resetting the rail and repeating the test several times, giving a great view of the loading dynamics on the booster pins and Chopsticks. With the last barrel section of the cryo tank cut in half now, the ring segment was laid over by the excavator and crushed flat. Following this week's work with the portside landing rail, workers began checking out the starboard Chopstick's landing rail, raising and lowering it several times. A new cryogenic storage tank, believed to be for storing liquid methane, was delivered to the port of Brownsville, then hauled to Sanchez, following the delivery of another liquid methane tank the day before. The new pristine tanks left traffic backed up while they were rolling it to the site. Meanwhile, back at the launch complex, workers began preparing to remove B14.1 from the orbital launch mount, hitching the load spreader to the tank ahead of the lift. Once the crane was hooked up, workers began to disconnect the gas pressure supply line from the test article and continued working past midnight to remove the plumbing from B14.1. Switching over to Florida, Cygnet Warhorse 1 towed a short fall of gravitas out to sea on Friday ahead of the Starlink Group 10-2 mission. At the Port Canaveral docks, outfitting of Blue Origin support ship Harvey Stone continued this week as Blue Origin draws closer to the first flight of the new Glenn, which is expected to take place later this year. SpaceX support ship Doug also headed out to sea on Friday morning in support of the GOES-U mission, the first Falcon Heavy launch of the year. Cygnet Warhorse 3 returned to Port Canaveral on Sunday with Just Read the Instructions and Falcon 9 Booster 1080 following the successful launch of Astra 1P. The Falcon 9 booster was lifted off Just Read the Instructions and placed onto the dockside stand shortly afterward, freeing up the landing ship for maintenance ahead of its next mission. Shortly after noon, Falcon 9 Booster 1078 lifted off on its 11th launch, carrying Starlink Group 10-2 into orbit, marking the shortest pad turnaround to date, as well as a record 20th flight of a Falcon 9 fairing. United Launch Alliance's rocket ship arrived with the Vulcan and Centaur 5 for the vehicle's second certification flight. This flight will fly a mass simulator into orbit to meet national security space launch certification requirements after its originally planned Dream Chaser payload was delayed. A Falcon 9 made its second flight of the day, this time from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, in a spectacular twilight launch of Starlink Group 9-2. This launch carried 20 V2 mini satellites, including 13 with direct-to-cell connectivity, into a polar orbit on Booster 1075. A busy Tuesday began with Falcon Heavy being raised vertical at LC-39A ahead of the GOES-U launch, scheduled to take place in the afternoon. Later that morning, Cygnet Warhorse 3 towed Just Read the Instructions to sea to support the Starlink Group 10-3 mission, 2 days ahead of its scheduled launch. And less than 2 hours later, SpaceX support ship Bob returned to Port Canaveral with 2 sets of fairing halves, one from Astra 1P and one from Starlink Group 10-2. Cygnet Warhorse 1 brought a short fall of gravitas and Falcon 9 Booster 1078 back home after the Starlink Group 10-2 launch and headed for the docks. After just a few hours in port, Bob headed right back out to sea again in support of the Starlink Group 10-3 mission. At 17:26 Eastern Daylight Time, Falcon Heavy lifted off from LC-39A, using the power of 27 Merlin engines to send the GOES-U weather satellite to space. Once in orbit, the second stage began a multi-hour coast phase ahead of relighting the second stage engine and directly inserting the GOES-U satellite into geostationary orbit. Following the successful liftoff and staging of Falcon Heavy, boosters 1072 and 1086 performed return-to-launch site landings, making soft touchdowns on LZ-1 and LZ-2. Thursday also saw Falcon 9 booster 1062 make a record-setting 20-second flight, launching the Starlink Group 10-3 mission into orbit. After 2 days at the docks, Falcon 9 booster 1078 was lifted off a short fall of gravitas and placed onto the dockside stand for stowage. And there you have it, another SpaceX and Starbase weekly update brought to you by LabPadre. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already, guys, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. LabPadre out.